Emma, a black marketing assistant, faces a devastating humiliation by corporate executives that sparks a deep reflection on her place in the professional world. With the encouragement of her best friend, she reconnects with her long-buried passion for writing, a legacy inherited from her late father. Emma walked into the sleek, glass-walled conference room with a steady confidence. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, fingertips tracing the smooth surface as she set down her presentation materials. This was her moment, the result of countless late nights and early mornings. She had prepared a comprehensive marketing strategy that could potentially take the company to the next level. But as the executives filtered into the room, she felt a wave of unease ripple through her. The men seated before her were a panel of senior executives, all middle-aged, white, and clearly detached from the younger, more diverse team members in the company. Their conversation was lively as they chatted with one another, mostly ignoring Emma as she stood in front of the projector, ready to begin. She straightened her blazer and cleared her throat. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady despite the knots forming in her stomach. "Today, I'll be presenting a new marketing strategy aimed at increasing our engagement with younger audiences across social media platforms." From the first slide, Emma knew something was wrong. The subtle chuckles, the way they exchanged glances, it was clear they weren't taking her seriously. Halfway through her presentation, one of the executives, a tall man named Richard, leaned back in his chair and interrupted her. "Emma, sweetheart, these are some interesting ideas, but social media, isn't that just for teenagers and influencers?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. His smirk was met with snickers from the others. Emma blinked, momentarily thrown off by the comment, but quickly regained her composure. "Actually, sir, data shows that a large percentage of our target audience spends a significant amount of time on these platforms, and—" Another interruption came, this time from a woman sitting next to Richard, Ashley, who had been one of the top executives in the company for years. She raised an eyebrow and added, "Do you really think this will work? I mean, are you sure you're up for this? These numbers seem a bit overambitious." The thinly veiled criticism stung. Emma could feel the sharpness of the words digging into her. Her heart pounded, but she pushed forward, refusing to let them see her falter. "Yes, I'm confident in these projections. The data is solid, and with the right approach, we can achieve." Another wave of dismissive laughter filled the room, this time louder, more open. Richard leaned forward, glancing at his colleagues before focusing on her again. "You know, it's a shame, Emma. You've got potential, but sometimes I think you're just trying too hard. Maybe you should stick to something a little less ambitious, don't you think?" It was a clear dismissal of everything she had worked for, an attack not just on her ideas, but on her very worth within the company. Emma felt the room closing in on her. Her fingers curled into her palm, nails digging into her skin as she fought to maintain her calm. But inside, it was like a slow burn had started, a quiet anger bubbling up from the pit of her stomach. She didn't let it show. Her voice, though quieter, remained steady. "Thank you for the feedback. I'll take that into consideration." The meeting wrapped up quickly after that. The executive stood, not bothering to shake her hand or offer further feedback, as if she had already been dismissed from their minds. Emma stayed behind, gathering her notes and laptop, her breath shallow and controlled. Her hands trembled slightly as she packed up, but she wouldn't let herself cry here. Not in this room, not in front of them. As she walked out of the conference room, the laughter behind her echoed in her ears, louder than ever. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she held her head high. She wouldn't let them see her break. Not here, not now. But as soon as she reached her office and closed the door behind her, the weight of it all came crashing down. Emma sank into her chair, staring blankly at her screen. The anger was there, but so was the hurt. It wasn't just the humiliation. It was the sense that no matter how hard she worked, she would never truly be seen as equal in this corporate world. Not by them. But this wasn't the end. That spark, the one ignited by their callousness, it began to grow. And in that moment of pain and humiliation, Emma realized something. She wasn't going to stay in this system where people like her were dismissed and undervalued. She had something else to give the world. something more powerful than they could ever understand. And that realization was just the beginning. The rain fell softly against the window pane as Emma sat on her couch, her laptop resting on her knees. Her fingers hovered above the keys, but she couldn't bring herself to type. The events from the office that morning still weighed heavily on her mind. She replayed the meeting in her head, over and over, trying to make sense of the sting of humiliation that seemed to linger long after the boardroom had emptied. A notification pinged on her phone. It was a message from Sarah, her closest friend and confidant. "Sarah, hey, how did the presentation go? Call me when you're free." Emma sighed, knowing she couldn't avoid the conversation forever. She picked up her phone and dialed Sarah's number. Within moments, her friend's warm, familiar voice filled the silence of the room. "Emma, I was waiting to hear how it went. Are we celebrating tonight, or?" Emma paused, unsure how to start. "It was awful, Sarah. Really awful." The line went quiet for a moment. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her tone instantly shifting from excited to concerned. They laughed at me," Emma began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was trying to present this marketing strategy, something I worked really hard on, but they didn't take me seriously. They made these condescending comments, like I didn't belong there." Sarah sighed. "Oh, Emma, I'm so sorry. Those people don't know what they're talking about." Emma leaned back against the couch, closing her eyes. "It's more than that, Sarah. It's not just this one meeting. It's everything. Every day I feel like no matter how hard I work, no matter how much I achieve, I'm always being judged for something I can't change. I don't know if I can keep doing this." Sarah's voice softened. "I know it's hard. I can't even imagine what that feels like. But Emma, you've got so much more to offer than what they see. And honestly, maybe the corporate world isn't where your true potential lies." Emma opened her eyes, staring up at the ceiling. "What do you mean?" "You've always been a writer at heart," Sarah replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Remember when we were in college? You used to stay up all night writing stories, pouring your heart and soul into them. Your dad was so proud of you. He used to say you had the gift, just like him." Emma felt a lump forming in her throat at the mention of her father. He had been a renowned journalist, a man of integrity who had spent his life chasing the truth and sharing it with the world. He had passed away a few years ago, but his passion for words and storytelling had always lived on in Emma. "Yeah," Emma whispered, her mind drifting back to those nights spent writing with her father's old typewriter. She could still remember the sound of the keys clacking, the smell of ink on paper, and the way her father would read over her work, offering advice with a smile. "You were always happiest when you were writing," Sarah continued. "Why not go back to that? You don't have to stay in a job where you're constantly being underestimated. Maybe this is your chance to do something that's actually fulfilling." Emma was silent for a moment, lost in thought. "It's not that simple, Sarah. Writing doesn't pay the bills, and I can't just quit. I'm stuck in this job. I need it." "I get that," Sarah replied, "but you don't have to quit right away. Just start writing again, even if it's just for you. It doesn't have to be for a paycheck. It can be for your soul." Emma laughed softly, despite herself. "You always make everything sound so easy." "It's not easy," Sarah said, her voice firm but kind. "But I hate seeing you like this, Emma. You're one of the strongest people I know, but I can tell this place is wearing you down. Maybe writing is what you need to find yourself again, to remember who you are, outside of that office." Emma sat in silence, staring at the screen of her unopened laptop. She hadn't written anything substantial in years. She had been so caught up in the corporate grind, climbing the ladder, proving herself, that she had forgotten about the joy she once found in words. "You're probably right," Emma admitted, "but it's just been so long. I'm not sure I even remember how to write anymore." "Of course you do," Sarah reassured her. "It's in your blood. It's who you are. You just need to start. Even if it's just a few sentences a day, you'll find your way back to it." Emma nodded, though Sarah couldn't see it. She glanced toward the bookshelf in the corner of her living room. Nestled between the rows of novels was a small stack of her father's old notebooks, filled with his handwritten notes and articles. She hadn't touched them in years. But now, the thought of opening them, of reconnecting with that part of herself, stirred something deep inside her. "Maybe I will," Emma said quietly. "Maybe it's time." "You've got this," Sarah replied, her voice full of encouragement. "And I'll be here, cheering you on every step of the way." After they hung up, Emma sat for a while in the quiet of her apartment. The rain continued to patter softly against the window, a calming rhythm that seemed to echo the thoughts swirling in her mind. She stood up, walked over to the bookshelf, and pulled out one of her father's old notebooks. It was worn, the edges frayed from years of use, but as she opened it, she felt a wave of nostalgia wash over her. His familiar handwriting filled the pages, each word a reminder of the man who had taught her so much about life, resilience, and the power of storytelling. Emma flipped through the pages, her eyes lingering on certain passages. His words were like a balm to her wounded spirit, a reminder that she, too, had a voice. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start using it again. With renewed resolve, Emma sat back down at her laptop. She opened a blank document and, for the first time in years, let her fingers begin to move across the keyboard. The words came slowly at first, but then, like water breaking through a dam, they began to flow. She wasn't sure where this journey would take her, but one thing was clear. It was time to reclaim the part of herself she had almost forgotten. It was time to write. Later that night, Emma sat in her dimly lit living room. The hum of the city outside barely noticeable over the quiet were of her thoughts. The pages of her father's notebooks lay spread out before her on the coffee table, each one a fragment of the life he had lived, a life that was so intertwined with the written word. She traced her fingers over the faded ink, remembering how he used to sit at the kitchen table, lost in thought, his pen moving steadily across the paper. As a child, Emma had often watched him work, fascinated by the way he could take the chaos of the world and mold it into something meaningful with nothing but his words. His stories had been a source of comfort and strength for her growing up, especially when life had been tough. Now, as she looked at the familiar handwriting, she felt that same sense of solace, as though he was still there, guiding her through her confusion. She picked up one of the notebooks, flipping through its worn pages. Her father had filled it with stories, articles, and musings, a mix of personal reflections and observations on the world around him. One page caught her eye, and she paused to read it carefully. The world will always find ways to make you feel small, but if you hold on to your truth, no one can take that from you. Writing is the way we speak back to the world. It's how we make our voices heard, no matter how many try to silence us. Emma swallowed hard, the words sinking deep into her chest. It was as if her father had known exactly what she needed to hear at this very moment, years after his passing. The world had been making her feel small for too long, and somewhere along the way, she had stopped speaking back. She had let the voices of others drown out her own, but no more. Inspired by her father's wisdom, she reached for her laptop again. She didn't know what she was going to write. She only knew that she had to. The words from earlier that day, the humiliation, the anger, all swirled in her mind, fighting to be expressed. She opened a blank document and began to type, letting everything pour out of her. At first, it was clumsy, like she was learning how to walk again after years of standing still. Her fingers stumbled over the keys, and the sentences felt awkward, unsure. But slowly, the words began to find their rhythm. She wrote about her frustrations, about the relentless need to prove herself in a world that seemed determined to belittle her. She wrote about the pain of being overlooked, of being treated as if she didn't matter. And then, she wrote about her father. She wrote about the strength he had shown, the lessons he had passed down to her, and how those lessons were still shaping her today. As the hours passed, the words flowed faster, her heart and mind working in unison, like they hadn't in years. There was a sense of freedom in it, a release she hadn't realized she needed. By the time she finished, it was well past midnight. Emma sat back, breathing heavily, her fingers still tingling from the rush of creativity. She glanced at the screen, her words staring back at her. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was real. It was her. As she reread what she had written, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not the corporate-driven pride of accomplishments on paper, but a deeper, more personal pride. the kind that came from doing something meaningful for herself. She hadn't written for the approval of anyone else. This was just for her. Emma closed her laptop and stood up, stretching her stiff limbs. She felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Walking to the window, she gazed out at the city lights, her mind still buzzing with the energy of what she had just created. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was back on the path she was meant to be on. The next morning, Emma awoke feeling more energized than she had in weeks. She brewed herself a strong cup of coffee and sat down at her laptop, eager to keep writing. The ideas flowed more easily now, her mind tapping into a well of creativity she had almost forgotten existed. She didn't know where this new path would lead, but for once, she wasn't worried about the destination. It was the journey that mattered. As she wrote, Emma thought about her father's legacy. He had always told her that writing was more than just a skill. It was a way to connect with people, to make them feel seen and heard. It was about telling stories that mattered, stories that could change the way people saw the world and themselves. And now, after years of silencing her own voice, Emma was ready to start telling her own stories. In the days that followed, Emma continued to write, finding comfort in the routine. Each night after work, she would sit down with her laptop and her father's notebooks, drawing inspiration from the words he had left behind. She wasn't sure what she was working toward. All she knew was that writing had become her refuge, her way of processing the world and all its complexities. One evening, as Emma was flipping through another one of her father's notebooks, she came across an article he had written shortly before his death. It was a piece about resilience, about how people find strength in the face of adversity, and how those who are marginalized often carry a deeper wisdom because of what they've had to endure. "We are more than the labels the world tries to put on us," he had written. "Our worth isn't measured by the approval of others, but by the strength we carry within us. And that strength comes from knowing who we are, no matter how many times the world tries to tell us otherwise." Emma stared at the words, tears welling in her eyes. Her father had always known exactly what to say, and in that moment, she realized that she wasn't just writing for herself anymore. She was writing for others like her, people who had been told they didn't belong, who had been made to feel small. She was writing to make them feel seen. That night, Emma made a decision. She was going to share her work, not with the corporate world, not with the people who had dismissed her, but with a world that needed stories like hers. She didn't know if anyone would read it, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she was finally ready to use her voice again. Her father's words echoed in her mind as she sat down to write once more. Writing is how we speak back to the world. And Emma was ready to speak. Emma's fingers hovered over the submit button on the writing contest website. She had been staring at the screen for what felt like hours, her heart pounding in her chest. The prestigious writing contest had been a suggestion from Sarah, one she had initially brushed off as a pipe dream. But after weeks of writing, of rediscovering her voice and reconnecting with her father's legacy, something had shifted inside her. Sarah had been relentless in her encouragement. "You've got something here, Emma. This isn't just you scribbling in a journal. You have a gift, and people need to see it," she had said over the phone just the day before. "Your story could inspire so many people. You have to at least try." Emma wasn't so sure. She had doubts, insecurities that gnawed at her every time she thought about sharing her work with the world. What if she wasn't good enough? What if the people who had dismissed her in the corporate world were right, and she didn't have what it took to be more than just a background figure? But Sarah's words, combined with the feeling that had been growing in her gut, pushed her forward. And here she was, hovering over the button that could either change everything or confirm her worst fears. The contest was a big deal. Winning it would mean recognition, validation, and maybe even an opportunity to step into a career she had once believed was out of reach. But the competition was fierce, and Emma knew she was up against seasoned writers with far more experience. The thought of it made her stomach turn. She clicked the button, and it was done. The story was sent. Emma closed her laptop, her hands shaking. A flood of relief and anxiety washed over her. There was no turning back now. She had laid herself bare, her vulnerabilities and her strengths, in the words she had submitted. Whether she won or not, at least she had taken the leap. In the weeks leading up to the contest results, Emma continued her routine of writing every evening after work. It had become a sanctuary for her, a way to escape the pressures of her corporate job and the lingering sting of that humiliating meeting. As much as she wanted to leave the company, the reality of bills and responsibilities kept her grounded. But writing gave her something to look forward to, something that was hers alone. One evening, as she was going over her latest piece, her phone buzzed. It was Sarah, once again. "Emma, I just met someone at this event I was covering." Sarah's voice was practically buzzing through the phone. "You won't believe it, but he's a published author. Like, a really successful one. His name is Daniel Cole, and he's agreed to meet you." Emma blinked, caught off guard. "Wait, what? How did this happen?" "I may have mentioned you," Sarah admitted sheepishly. "Okay, fine. I definitely mentioned you. I told him about your work, about the contest, everything. He's interested, Emma. He wants to help you." Emma's heart raced. "But I haven't won anything. I'm not even sure if I will. Why would he be interested in me?" "Because he believes in talent, and I believe in you," Sarah replied firmly. "Look, he's agreed to meet you for coffee tomorrow. Just talk to him. Hear what he has to say. What's the worst that could happen?" Emma bit her lip. The idea of meeting a successful author felt both exciting and terrifying. But Sarah was right. What did she have to lose? The next day, Emma found herself sitting in a cozy cafe, nervously fidgeting with the edge of her cup. The door chimed, and she looked up to see a tall man with tousled brown hair and an easy smile walk in. Daniel Cole. He spotted her almost immediately and made his way over. "Emma, right?" he said, extending his hand. His voice was warm and approachable, instantly putting her at ease. "Yeah, that's me," Emma replied, shaking his hand. They settled into their conversation easily. Daniel asked her about her writing, about the story she had submitted for the contest. He listened intently as Emma explained her journey back to writing and how it had been a way for her to cope with the struggles of her corporate life. She was surprised at how comfortable she felt talking to him. "Sarah's told me a lot about you," Daniel said, leaning back in his chair. "From what I hear, you've got a real gift for storytelling. I can tell you've poured a lot of yourself into your work." Emma flushed, feeling both flattered and embarrassed. "I guess I have. It's been a bit of an escape, really." "Good," Daniel nodded. "Writing should be personal. That's what makes it powerful. And from what you've shared, you've got something to say that people need to hear. It's not just about winning contests. It's about connecting with readers." Emma felt a flicker of hope. "Do you really think I have a chance? I mean, there are so many talented writers out there." Daniel smiled gently. "Talent isn't just about experience. It's about heart. And it sounds like you've got plenty of that. I won't lie, the writing world can be tough. But if you love it, if you believe in your voice, you've already won half the battle." They talked for over an hour, discussing the craft of writing, the ups and downs of the publishing industry, and the importance of resilience. By the end of the meeting, Emma felt more inspired than she had in years. Before they parted ways, Daniel handed her his business card. "Keep writing, Emma. Don't stop. If you ever need advice or guidance, reach out. And remember, your voice matters." The following weeks passed in a blur of anticipation and self-doubt. The contest results were looming, and Emma couldn't help but feel the weight of it pressing down on her. Each time her phone buzzed, her heart jumped, wondering if it would be the email that would either affirm her newfound sense of purpose or crush it. One evening, after a long day at work, Emma sat on her couch, staring at her inbox. She knew the results were coming soon, and the waiting was unbearable. Sarah had called earlier, trying to cheer her up, but nothing could quell the anxiety gnawing at her. Just as she was about to close her laptop, a notification appeared. "Congratulations! You've been selected as a finalist in the prestigious New Voices writing contest." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She read the words over and over again, her mind struggling to process the reality. She was a finalist. Out of hundreds, maybe even thousands, of submissions, her story had made it to the top. She immediately called Sarah, her hands trembling as she held the phone. "Sarah, I did it. I'm a finalist." Sarah screamed with joy on the other end of the line. "I knew it. Emma, this is amazing. You're one step closer to winning this thing." As the excitement began to settle, Emma felt a new wave of emotions wash over her. This was her moment, a chance to prove to herself and to the world that her voice mattered, that she could be more than what the corporate world saw in her. The next step was presenting her story at the contest's final event in front of an audience and judges. And for the first time, Emma wasn't afraid. She had spent years hiding behind her insecurities, letting others define her worth. But now, she was ready to stand tall, to speak her truth. Her father's words echoed in her mind, steady and reassuring. Writing is how we speak back to the world. And Emma was ready to speak louder than she ever had before. The day of the contest arrived, and Emma stood backstage, her heart pounding in her chest. The grand hall was packed with people, other finalists, judges, and a curious audience eager to hear the stories that had been deemed the best of the best. The spotlight felt so close, so hot, even though she wasn't under it yet. She clenched her hands together, trying to steady her breath. Her story, one that was deeply personal, was about to be shared with the world. It wasn't just words on a page. It was her journey, her struggles, and her defiance against a system that had tried to silence her. The stakes had never felt higher. Her thoughts were interrupted by Sarah's voice beside her. "You're going to crush this, Emma. You've already won by being here." Emma forced a smile. "Thanks, Sarah. I'm just trying not to think about all the eyes that are about to be on me." Sarah squeezed her shoulder. "Focus on why you're here. Remember why you started writing again. You've already faced worse than this." Emma nodded, feeling some of the tension leave her body. Sarah was right. She had faced worse: humiliation, dismissal, belittlement. This, in comparison, was just another step in her journey. She took a deep breath and looked out at the stage. Soon, it would be her turn. As the contestants before her presented their stories, Emma's nerves began to settle. Each one was talented, no doubt, but none of them were telling the kind of story Emma was. Hers was a story of struggle, of being overlooked and underestimated. A story about resilience and finding one's voice in a world that preferred silence from people like her. Finally, it was her time. Her name was called, and with her heart in her throat, she stepped onto the stage. The bright lights hit her, momentarily blinding her, but she forced herself to stay calm. The judges sat in the front row, their faces impassive, waiting for her to begin. Emma glanced around the audience and suddenly froze. Sitting toward the back, almost hidden among the crowd, was Ashley, the same executive who had belittled her during that fateful meeting, the woman who had questioned her abilities and reduced her efforts to nothing more than overambition. Her stomach twisted as their eyes met, and Ashley gave a smirk that sent a chill down Emma's spine. She hadn't expected to see her here, of all places. For a moment, Emma's resolve wavered. She felt that familiar sting of humiliation rise in her chest, the memory of being laughed at and dismissed flooding back in a wave of insecurity. No, she thought, not this time. Emma squared her shoulders, her grip on the microphone tightening. Ashley's presence might have rattled her, but it wouldn't stop her. Emma began to speak, her voice shaky at first but growing stronger with every word. She told her story, not just the one she had written, but the one that had been bubbling inside her for years. She spoke of her experiences, of the many times she had been overlooked and doubted, and of how those experiences had shaped her into the person standing before them today. Her story wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming her identity in a world that constantly tried to take it away. The room was silent as Emma's words filled the air. She poured her heart into every sentence, her voice steady and clear, despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. This wasn't just about winning a contest anymore. It was about standing up for herself, for all the times she had been made to feel invisible. It was about speaking back to the world that had tried to quiet her. When she finished, the silence hung heavy in the room. For a moment, she thought she had miscalculated, that perhaps her story had been too raw, too real for the polished world of literary contests. But then, slowly, the applause started. First, a few hesitant claps, and then more, until the entire hall was filled with the sound of appreciation. Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had done it. She had bared her soul, and instead of rejection, she was met with applause. Her eyes scanned the audience, and she saw Sarah in the front row, beaming with pride. But as her gaze moved to the back, her heart sank. Ashley's expression was anything but approving. She leaned over to the person next to her and whispered something, a smirk curling her lips. Emma could feel the familiar pang of doubt creeping back in. After the presentations were over, the finalists gathered on stage for the announcement of the winner. Emma stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, trying to stay calm. She had done her best, but whether or not it was enough was out of her hands now. As the host began to read the judge's decision, Emma's pulse quickened. She barely heard the names of the runners-up being announced, her mind too busy racing through all the possibilities. And then, finally, the moment came. And the winner of this year's New Voices Writing Contest is Emma Harris. The words seemed to echo in her ears. For a second, she stood frozen in place, unable to believe what she had just heard. But then, as the applause filled the hall once again, the realization hit her. She had won. Emma stepped forward to accept the award, her hands trembling as she took the plaque from the host. It felt surreal, like a dream she had never quite believed could come true. The cheers from the audience were deafening, and as she looked out at the sea of faces, she felt a swell of pride unlike anything she had ever experienced. But as she descended the stage, plaque in hand, she caught sight of Ashley once more. This time, the smirk on Ashley's face had hardened into something more venomous. Before Emma could react, Ashley stood up and made her way to the front of the hall, where a group of people had gathered around Emma to offer their congratulations. Well, look at you," Ashley said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You really know how to play the victim, don't you, Emma? I guess that's what sells these days." The crowd around Emma went silent, the celebratory atmosphere suddenly shifting. Emma felt a familiar knot form in her stomach, but this time, she wasn't going to let Ashley have the last word. She straightened her back and met Ashley's gaze head-on. "This isn't about playing the victim, Ashley. It's about telling the truth. Maybe you don't understand that because you've never had to fight to be heard." Ashley's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, the crowd seemed to hold its breath. But before the tension could escalate further, a familiar voice cut through the silence. "She's right." Emma turned to see Daniel Cole standing beside her, his expression firm. Emma's story is powerful because it's real. And that's exactly what this world needs more of, voices that aren't afraid to speak up, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people like you. Ashley's smirk faltered, and for a moment, she seemed caught off guard. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Emma standing there with Daniel and the others. Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She glanced at Daniel, who gave her a supportive nod. "Thanks," she whispered. "You didn't need my help," he replied. "You handled that just fine on your own." Emma smiled, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lift from her shoulders. She had faced down her doubts, her insecurities, and even her detractors. And she had won. Not just the contest, but the battle within herself. The days after Emma's victory were a whirlwind. The award, the recognition, and the validation were more than she had ever dreamed of. Her name appeared in literary blogs, social media posts, and even a couple of local news outlets. For the first time, Emma felt like her voice was being heard by more than just herself. She had arrived. But as the glow of the contest began to fade, reality crept back in. Emma still had her job to go to, still had bills to pay, and while the prize money was helpful, it wasn't enough to change her life overnight. Winning the contest was a step forward, but it wasn't the finish line. One evening, just a few days after the contest, Emma received an anonymous email. The subject line sent a shiver down her spine. "We know what you did." She opened it slowly, her heart pounding as she read the contents. "Congrats on your win, but we both know you've got a past you're hiding. How long until everyone else finds out?" The email had no signature, no identifying details. It was just a few lines of text, but it hit her like a punch in the gut. Emma's mind raced. What could they be talking about? What past? Sure, she wasn't perfect. No one was. But what could someone possibly know about her that would be worth threatening her over? Her thoughts spiraled as she tried to piece it together. She hadn't made any major mistakes, at least none that could come back to haunt her in a meaningful way. But the email implied something, and its ambiguity made it all the more terrifying. She spent the next few days on edge, waiting for another email, a call, or some kind of revelation. She didn't mention the email to anyone, not even Sarah, not wanting to burden her friend with the anxiety she was now carrying. But the constant sense of dread gnawed at her, overshadowing the joy of her recent success. One evening, Emma sat at her desk, staring at her laptop, the anonymous email still open on the screen. She could keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, or she could confront it head-on. She thought of her father's words, the ones that had guided her through so much already. Our worth isn't measured by the approval of others, but by the strength we carry within us. She had faced down worse than this before. She had been humiliated, dismissed, and doubted her whole life. Whoever had sent this email, whoever wanted to tear her down, didn't know the journey she had been on. She wasn't that scared, uncertain person anymore. She wasn't going to let this define her. Emma took a deep breath and began writing. She wrote about the fear, the doubt, the feeling of being under constant threat, not just from this anonymous email, but from a lifetime of systemic and personal barriers. She poured her heart into the piece, letting the words flow from a place of deep vulnerability. This wasn't just about the email anymore. It was about everything. It was about taking control of her narrative, about refusing to let fear silence her. When she finished, she sat back and read over the words she had written. They were raw, personal, and unflinchingly honest. But they were hers. And instead of running from the threat, she decided to face it. The next day, Emma posted the piece on her personal blog, which had been largely dormant since she started writing again. She shared the story of her journey, from the corporate world that had tried to diminish her to the contest that had given her a platform, and finally, to the anonymous email that threatened to undo it all. She didn't hold back, detailing the challenges of being a Black woman in a world that was always looking for reasons to discredit her. Her story resonated. It spread quickly, shared by friends, colleagues, and eventually, by complete strangers who saw themselves in her words. The blog post was picked up by a few larger platforms, and soon, Emma's inbox was filled with messages of support from people who had read her story and found strength in it. As the days passed, the email that had once filled her with dread faded into the background. The anonymous threat had lost its power. Emma had reclaimed her voice once again, and this time, she wasn't hiding behind it. A few weeks later, Emma found herself sitting in the same cafe where she had met Daniel Cole. This time, though, she wasn't waiting for anyone else. She was there to reflect, to take a moment to breathe. Her phone buzzed with another congratulatory message from a stranger who had read her blog post, but this time, it didn't fill her with anxiety. She had learned to handle the attention, the spotlight. It was no longer something to fear. She had also received an offer from a small but respected publishing house to turn her story into a full-length memoir. The thought of it thrilled her, but also reminded her of how much work still lay ahead. This journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. As she sipped her coffee, she felt a presence nearby. Glancing up, she saw Ashley, the executive who had humiliated her months before, standing by the counter. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Emma felt the familiar twist of anger and resentment. But instead of looking away, she held Ashley's gaze. Ashley hesitated, then walked over. "Emma," she said, her voice measured. "I read your story. I saw the post." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I didn't realize," Ashley said, her voice faltering slightly. "What I said in that meeting, I didn't mean to." "You did," Emma cut in, her voice calm but firm. "You meant exactly what you said, and it hurt. But that's in the past now." Ashley stood there, unsure of how to respond. For a moment, it seemed like she wanted to say more, but then she simply nodded and walked away. Emma watched her leave, a sense of closure settling over her. She wasn't looking for an apology, and she didn't need one. She had moved past that moment, past the need for validation from people like Ashley. Her worth wasn't something others could define anymore. That evening, Emma sat by her window, looking out at the city lights. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was also wide open. She was no longer bound by the fear of failure or the judgment of others. She had found her voice, her strength, and most importantly, her sense of self. As she opened her laptop and began to write, the words flowed freely, filled with the fire of everything she had been through. Emma had faced her fears, conquered her doubts, and emerged stronger than ever. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning.